Okay, so I'm pleased to introduce Cody Smith from OARnet. He is going to be talking about his experiences in running a perfSONAR service for OARnet and for the state of Ohio. So I'll turn it over to Cody. Go ahead.
Thanks, Jason. Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining me today. As Jason alluded to, today we're just going to talk about running a statewide perfSONAR mesh. So let's hop into it. A little bit about me. I'm a cyber infrastructure engineer with OARnet. I've been with the OARperf project and OARnet for over a year now, and I like to use Vim. I always like to include a fun fact in these about the presenter slides. About OARnet, for those of you that don't know, we run a statewide 100 gig backbone. We cater to higher education, K through 12, state institutions, things of the like. And we have a couple statewide groups, and these will come in play here later. But we have ORTech, ORSEC, and OARperf. ORTech is the more networking technology related group. ORSEC is the more information security related. And OARperf, as you can guess, is more of the perfSONAR OARperf related group. So today we're going to talk about how we quote unquote sold universities on using perfSONAR and the OARperf project. It wasn't an easy sell for some, but it worked out in the end. We're going to talk about how we went about training all these engineers and how we made the statewide effort to do that. After that, after you train and implement, you have to maintain that mesh. So we're going to talk about what all goes into that, some of the pain points that came about, and then I plan to leave a little bit of time for questions and things like that, because I always find that to be the most interesting part of any talk such as this one. So let's jump into it. We had to sell universities on perfSONAR. Back when I was in higher education, when I worked at a university, I realized we had no way really to measure network performance when someone complained about the quote-unquote speed of the internet. And really the only way to do this at the time was to run, speedtest.net. So I fit in that category of knowing, hey, if I need to test the internet speed, maybe the only reliable way to do this is speedtest.net. I wasn't very experienced at the time, had no clue what perfSONAR was, what iPerf was, or anything of the nature. And there are a lot of network professionals that are the same exact way. Some of the more experienced network professionals know about tools like iPerf, etc. But a lot of newer network professionals don't. They know if they need to check their internet speed, they just go to speedtest.net, hit the little button in the center, and it gives them a close enough response, depending on who your provider is. So how did we sell universities on this? First, just the fact that there were consistent measurement tools that were built by the community or built by different universities or institutions was a huge plus to a lot of them. A lot of them didn't even know perfSONAR existed. They didn't know the project itself was a thing. So to introduce them to this was actually a pretty sweet, dare I say, feeling, because they went, oh, this could be useful to me. At the same time, we sold them on the fact that it has graphs to show sea levels. So a sea-level executive 95% of the time is not going to know what throughput is or what, what your bandwidth, what that means to them. All they know is the more bandwidth you need, the more money they have to pay. So if you say, hey, look, we're not consistently getting this, we might need to switch to a different service provider, being able to show them a colorful graph with a line that's bouncing all the time may persuade them. And that was actually something that helped me back when I was at a university, is being able to show a graph, not showing digits and numbers on a spreadsheet, but actually being able to draw a line and say, this is where we are, and this is where we should be, is a huge +1 for a lot of those conversations. At the same time, we sold them on the fact that perfSONAR implements both on-demand testing and scheduled testing that just runs and works. A lot of the pushback I got originally was everybody thought it was only on-demand testing. So they were like, oh, well, I don't have an intern that knows how to do this stuff, or, I really don't know how to run tests all the time, and I'll forget, and I don't have time. And one of the major benefits of perfSONAR is the ability to schedule these tests and just have it run. Not having to constantly go in every 4 hours and run a bandwidth test. Instead, perfSONAR just kind of takes the load off you and runs it. So, with the addition of the OARperf project, which was CCIE funded originally, we were able to distribute about 18 servers over the course of 2 years. There was a couple servers distributed before my time, and then after I got there, we really tried to ramp up the project, and I think we did a pretty good job of that. So the fact that they got a free server from us, the only stipulation is that it is still OARnet's server, it's still our property. The fact that we were just sending them out to them, all they had to do was plug it in, configure it with their user, and then they were off to the races. That was a huge +1 for a lot of them as well. A lot of them, they have the argument that they don't have time to install this thing, they don't have a spare server sitting around or anything like that. So we alleviated a lot of those questions and a lot of those issues. So after you sell the universities on perfSONAR and you get the nodes out to them, the next thing that has to happen is you have to be able to train these engineers or these employees of universities. Otherwise, in my opinion, they'll never get used, or they'll never get used properly. So OARnet held 2 OARperf workshops. One was an initial run, it was before my time, and when we looked at the feedback from that, we got 2 things. A, it was a great workshop, it was very in-depth, and it was helpful. But some people felt like they were kind of left in the dust. So the second workshop we had was a lot more finite, a lot more granular. And we started off by saying, hey, we sent everybody a node. All I need is for you to have access to your node from externally. I gave them our/24 that I knew they'd be accessing from so they can make the firewall rules and such and so forth. And the only requirement was you don't have to have it set up or anything of that nature. I just need you to have SSH access to it. So when they came in, we had questions about, I'm using a Mac. What should I use to SSH? Or, do you have any preferences or things like that? So we spent the first hour or so of the day just handling basic Linux access questions. Just, the underpinnings of SSH and how things need to work, which is out of the scope of perfSONAR. However, having these conversations that we had of, what's the best way to edit a file, or how do I transfer files from my Mac to the perfSONAR node, or things of that nature. I feel that it made a lot of the people there a better perfSONAR administrator, yet alone a better Linux user, being able to focus on the Linux side of it and then say, okay, now that you know how CentOS works, here's perfSONAR on top of it. And I noticed in the second half of the day when we really started to cover perfSONAR, in depth, they had a much greater understanding. They're like, oh, this is how editing this file and transferring things in compares to what we learned in the first half of the day. At the same time, and I think this is greatly important, in all the presentations or workshops or things like that I've hosted or had, I enjoy the question and answer section. That's why I plan to leave some extra time at the end of this. Every time I've given a talk at a security conference, I've left plenty of time for questions. I feel that that's when your quote unquote students or attendees, I feel that's when they really develop and when they really move forward is when they're going to have an open conversation and ask questions and things of that nature. At the same time, we made sure to leave time for students to work on their nodes. We wanted time for them to ask, hey, I see this really weird thing going on. So we did some live troubleshooting in the workshop. One university was having weird problems, and we identified the device that problem would be on. Just those little extra tidbits of information and those little extra tidbits of time made a huge difference in my mind. And when we looked at the feedback from the course, the feedback echoed that. The feedback echoed that, it was really, really nice to have these extra training sessions and training time and just the open environment of the workshop. So we've given everybody a node, we've trained them on it. So now the fun part, where the rubber meets the road. We get to use and maintain the statewide mesh. So one of the biggest problems with running a statewide mesh, and we'll get into this in pain points too, is communication. OARnet only controls 2, soon to be 3 perfSONAR nodes in this entire mesh of 20 or so servers. And that means we have to talk to everybody frequently. We have a OARperf user mailing list similar to the perfSONAR user mailing list. At the same time, all of our node administrators know they can email me, they can call me if they have any questions, they can get a hold of me and say, hey, we have this thing. And I think that communication is really important because it's helped us tackle some pretty decent problems that network administrators are having. And at the same time, it allowed us to just develop a better dialogue. It's really nice to go to state meetings and things like that and see people from your member institutions and know who they are, know their name, know the problems they've had, and be able to have that open discussion with them. At the same time, we hold an OARperf meeting. This is what I referenced earlier. With the other statewide OARnet meetings, OTEC, ORTEC, ORSEC, etc. This is just about an hour-long meeting, but it's time for me to give a quick update on the mesh, on the node, and it's really time for open discussion amongst, hey, do you guys want to do this, or would you like to do more testing, less testing? If they have any silly questions that they just didn't want to bother me with over email, we can do all of those things. So the last thing that really comes into maintaining a statewide mesh is making sure the connections can still happen. Frequently, probably twice a week, I have to contact a university or two and say, hey, for some reason I'm seeing a lot of degraded performance here. And they're like, oh, well, somebody was messing around the switch, so maybe they plugged in something they shouldn't have, and now it's just eating up all the bandwidth that server's on, or something of that nature. Just silly problems crop up. And in my experience, 9 times out of 10, the security guy just got way too happy, and he just started blocking ports left and right. And sure enough, it blocked one of the ports for pscheduler or something of that nature. It just created a weird problem that we shouldn't have had otherwise. So maintaining a mesh is probably the biggest problem, but there's some other pain points. And they all pretty much relate back to maintaining that mesh. Like I said before, this is a statewide mesh, and OARnet only has 2 nodes, soon to be 3, under our control. So we have to communicate to a lot of other colleges and universities. This doesn't seem like a big problem for some people, but when you're trying to hold, simultaneously, 16 or 17 dialogues within your own member institution, and at the same time you're querying other, whether it be SNet or I2 or Quilt or different things of that nature, you're trying to, contact these different organizations to be part of their mesh or work with part of their mesh. It can be kind of strenuous at times. But at the same time, you have to realize you need to talk to all of these people when you're doing things that require massive coordination. So one of the biggest things with the perfSONAR project that's coming up is they're deprecating support for CentOS 6. So this isn't going to be nearly as simple as an upgrade from perfSONAR 3.5.1 as it was, perfSONAR 3.5.1 to perfSONAR 4, because that was a pretty easy transition for the OARperf group. I had everybody turn off auto updates, which seems like a silly thing to do because otherwise it would have done it by itself. But I had them turn off auto updates. The week after it came out, there were some issues. After those issues got patched up, I said, hey, everybody, over the next 2 weeks, make sure you upgrade to perfSONAR 4.0. When you do that, I'll add you back into the mesh and we'll work from there. So the reasoning for that, even though it seems kind of repetitive and unneeded, is it allowed me to really control the number of issues we had. So one university was able to upgrade, the Monday after. They have someone that does this sort of thing. They have a cyber infrastructure engineer. And sure enough, they had a small problem. We ironed that out and we moved forward. The next day we had one more person contact me and say, hey, I think I'm doing this right, but I just want you to check it. We checked it. It was fine. So those are really, really nice and easy to do. However, the transition from CentOS 6 to CentOS 7 will be very different because it's a decent migration to have to do. So that's something we're currently tackling as a group, is figuring out, when are we going to do this? Are we going to leave, a week for everybody to do this? Or are we going to leave 2 weeks, which is the common time frame that this group seems to pick? Your mileage may vary on that. But we have to coordinate with everybody. So this is sending out a lot of doodle polls. This is listening to feedback. This is getting emails and collaborating with other administrators. And it's trying to fill that that communication gap that otherwise would occur when you're running a mesh that spans a state. And at the same time, we're still growing too. So we're introducing new members. We're introducing new wants, new needs. We're seeing a lot of our universities as they go on the OARnet side, as they go from a less than 1 gig or 1 gig connection, and they're bumping that up. They're wanting to include something like a perfSONAR node. At the same time, it's not just the statewide mesh that we have to worry about. We have a lot of universities that are trying to do intra-campus meshes. They've got one off-site campus they've got themselves. They want to do a mesh there, or they're just a really large institution and they want to put a server in each individual dorm, give it an IP address, and have it test each other, and that's fine too. But that's part of my job as the cyber infrastructure engineer at OARnet, is to hop in the car, go out to these universities and talk with them. But that's another thing to consider if you're going to do a statewide mesh, is how this is going to affect each of the individual institutions, and not just how it can benefit you, because obviously the mesh has a great benefit to OARnet, right? It provides very valuable network insight to our engineers, to me, and just as an overall general picture of the network. We have other monitoring tools, we have all this amazing homegrown software, but this is just a nice, really simple way to run some tests every now and again. At the same time, it's worth thinking, if you roll out this statewide mesh, do you want to get other institutions? Do you want to get other institutions on board with this? We're peering with multiple institutions around us, and we're testing against those. And it's a really nice way to gain network insight. But once again, it's one more contact or one more, person that may have different needs. At the same time, you have to start thinking, when you're on a scale like OARnet, I have clients that only have a 100 megabit per second connection, but they want a perfSONAR node. So I'm not denying them a perfSONAR node and saying, aha, sorry, this is for the big colleges only. But we have to kind of tune our tests. It's very unfair for me to test a 100 gig client versus a 100 megabit per second client, because in theory, the 100 megabit per second client is never going to go out of the quote-unquote green zone on the MADASH, and is never going to reach the green zone. I apologize. And the 100 gigabit per second client is never going to reach below the green zone, because they'd have to lose such a percentage of their bandwidth. So we're starting to incorporate multiple grids, multiple dashboards, multiple tests. So the more and more you grow this thing and the more diverse your client set gets, the more interesting your MADASH configuration gets. We're currently in a rebuild for ours. That way we can accommodate some more 100 gig nodes and some more 10 gig clients that want to be added in. So I said this was going to be a relatively short talk. I meant it, because there's not a whole lot to running a statewide mesh. But I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions or comments or concerns or things like that. So with that being said, I'm Cody Smith. I'm the cyber infrastructure engineer at OARnet. If you have any questions, you can always email me, but I'd much rather get those questions out of the way now. So feel free to ask.
Okay, well, thank you, Cody. I've already jotted down a couple, so I'll take the first couple of whacks at this, and then we'll let others just use the chat room. What's the most interesting problem you found so far? And not just a firewall, because, hey, we all have firewalls, but anything truly difficult that you wouldn't have found without this tool?
Some of the truly difficult ones are the weird old devices hidden somewhere in a network closet that for some reason your traffic's going through. It's not on the OARnet side, it's typically on the campus side. They don't know that they have this really weird routing that's happening intercampus. So we find this and it's like, why is all your traffic from this dorm running through this old Cisco 1950 that's in the bottom of a closet somewhere? And they're like, oh, we didn't even know that was happening. Well, now you do. We find a lot of those really weird issues. We find a lot of memory buffer issues. People are using older switches and they didn't really think about it or anything of that nature. So we're finding weird issues like that pretty frequently. But nonetheless, it's an interesting problem to tackle.
Okay. And what is the biggest challenge that you have in supporting this? And let's look at it from two ways. If there's a problem with the software, or the software could be made easier, that feedback can easily be passed on to the development group. But also as a user, and you can think about this in terms of, let's say, somebody from a small institution or somebody who's just not familiar with it. What's a challenge for them in learning how to really adopt this and use this?
So from a personal standpoint, from the from like the software side. I think a lot of my issues are being addressed. I'm currently working on the mesh config administrator install on a couple nodes in the test bed that we have at OARnet. So I think that's going to solve a lot of my issues, but I think it just takes a little bit longer than I'd care to do some mesh configurations on the MADASH side. But that's the great thing about the perfSONAR project is I can give that feedback to the dev team, and sure enough, I'll get a ping back in a couple hours and be like, hey, just so you know, you can do that this way. And Stan's like, oh, that makes my life so much easier. From a user perspective, and I don't know if anyone on this call can echo that same feeling, but I was very, very surprised the number of network engineers that don't have a Linux background. And this isn't, I should preface this isn't, degrading my opinion to those people in any way, but I was surprised. I was like, man. So I think the biggest inhibitor for the perfSONAR project is the fact that it is on Linux. And there's no way to get around that, right? Like, this is an open source project. It has to be done that way. But I'd love to see, and I think a lot of my, the people that I have in this mesh, I think something they would like to see is they would like to see something like the speedtest.net, where you can literally just click a button on the main page and it'll run a test to a central server. I think that's it, but that's just an ease of use thing. That's something that, they can get comfortable with Linux if they really choose to and if they want to learn, but some of them just don't have that desire. So I think that's been an inhibitor for us gaining a couple more users of our mesh, is they don't know Linux and they don't want to know Linux.
Okay. So along those lines, I think everybody on the call is aware of this, but if not, surprise, Web 100 support within the perfSONAR project is going to fade away with the release of the next version that's coming out at the end of the year. This is for two real reasons, right? It's a practical thing because the project wants to move to a new version of CentOS, and the Web 100 patches don't cleanly apply to or apply at all to the new kernel that's going to be in there. So there's a reason for that. Second reason is that, the Web 100 based tools were all built assuming older congestion control algorithms, Reno and whatnot. So NDT really hasn't quite worked as well as it probably could in recent years. Now, there are things that have been adapted to sort of gear themselves towards the unsophisticated user community, those that really do wish to have a button. What are you going to do when Web 100 goes away? Is there a solution to have a button clicker type of tool, or are you just going to fall back and rely on the regular testing?
I think from our perspective, and by the way, you mentioned the Web 100 thing, and I think that was my first introduction to outrage in the cyber infrastructure community. There were a couple people that adamantly mailed the list as soon as they saw that, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. But I think our goal is we're trying to look at different ways to implement that quote unquote one button testing. At the same time, we're also looking at possibly dual purposing some of these higher power nodes that we're getting in. We're getting some 10 gig testing nodes in. So we're looking at possibly being able to make it to where, along with running perfSONAR, we're looking to have a box that isn't in the mesh. It's not tested against all the time. So we're possibly thinking about trying to build an application on top of that. That way they could have that one-click functionality. We're trying to find different ways to tie that in. But we want all of our universities to be able to use the software. We want all of our universities to be able to get solid, reliable network performance testing.
Okay. So Cynthia has a question. How do you feel about running MADASH on the same box as perfSONAR, which I'm guessing she means one of the actual testers who's involved in running live tests?
Yeah. So this is something that we're currently doing, right? Our MADASH server is technically tested against. It's part of the quote unquote mesh. And I know that is not a recommended practice according to perfSONAR. It says it in the documentation. It says we don't advise running MADASH on the same exact. I don't know if it's in the perfSONAR documentation. It might be over in the ESNet MADASH documentation. However, it's in one of those two pieces of documentation, and it explicitly says, hey, we don't recommend this, but you can do it. Obviously, you can do it. You can do whatever you want with these servers. But, we're doing it And the reason is it's kind of a reliability standpoint. I know I'm always going to have one of the two servers up, so I can test between my two servers. At the same time, we're working to pull back that grid, so a lot less is testing against my MADASH server. It's probably just going to be internal OARnet nodes at that point. But that's how I feel about it. But I know for a fact, somewhere in a piece of documentation, it says don't do that. So take that with a grain of salt.
And I think I probably assisted the team with writing that documentation, but my fear for this, and perhaps it's unfounded, is that depending on how busy the dashboard happens to be, you're going to be dealing with just little HTTP requests, which, you know, are not big from the standpoint of flow or anything like that, but they do have the potential to perturb the box. If it's in the middle of doing testing, it's stealing CPU cycles or RAM away from something that's going on. So from a network measurement pureness perspective, it probably makes sense to let the boxes be boxes and let the dashboard be a dashboard. But in the grand scheme of things, I doubt that it really is instituting a lot of pollution into the measurement.
Yeah, and I mean, and let's be clear, if a lot of the goal of the perfSONAR project is to be a accessible, affordable option for this sort of thing, if you're an institution that can only afford 2 servers, then you're going to put one at your main campus and one at your remote campus, and then you want to peer with some other stuff and throw some small boxes out through your campus, it's probably okay to do this, right? You know, it's not like we're attaching my life support to this box, and if it drops below a gig, it turns off, right? So it just depends on how much you. It's the same argument for virtualizing these things, right? So it's the same argument for putting a perfSONAR node in AWS or any other cloud hosting platform, or just virtualizing it. You can do it, but it's not advised because you might not get the perfect results every time. But if you don't care about the perfect results, if you just care about being able to glance and say, okay, we're okay-ish, then maybe it's still an advisable thing to do. I don't know. I don't want to speak out of turn here.
No, I think that's a fair way to do it, and many people do run at a minimum the dashboard in a virtual machine. You know, we do it for that exact reason. Virtual machines are cheap, and we can migrate it to a different data center if we're having an issue.
Perfect.
So let's see. I have a request. If you don't mind sharing your dashboard, why don't you pull that up and let's take a look at that.
Unfortunately, it is in a very small state right now. I think I'm only testing against, even though the JSON shows differently, we only have about 3 different nodes right now. So up on the current dashboard, and that's simply because we're just currently doing some testing. So I don't know if you can see this, but this is all it is currently. It's because I'm making some configuration changes to the MADASH.yaml file.
It looks like we just see your PowerPoint right now, so it's probably
that's right.
Your
yeah,
real estate.
But nonetheless, it's in a slightly degraded state today, which thinking back wasn't the best idea to do. But yeah, it's what happened today. Today's the day that I typically make changes to that sort of thing, because it gets me out of having to do it during the middle of the week. I can make some changes, and not everybody's looking at this thing today. So I can gladly send out that link. I can send that link to you, Jason, and then when you send out the link for the recorded video, you can just tag that in there.
Okay. So at one point you mentioned that you do have customers that are smaller speeded networks, and you're testing from a larger speeded network. And I have a memory of talking to you about TCP pacing. Did you ever implement that between some of your large and small sites to make sure that you're not overwhelming?
So we implement the TCP pacing when we have a dedicated node OARnet that's nothing but, it's not tied to any mesh. We can send out a spare server that I have. We send it to a client site, and we can hook it up, and we can just run some constant OWAMP testing or something of that nature just to check a connection for them if they're complaining of issues. So that's when we start to implement that TCP pacing. When we have a 15 megabit per second client and we're testing from a 1 gig node, we just don't want to overload that entire client. So that's when we start to implement some of that TCP pacing that we mentioned. I think that was at the NiserNet workshop.
Mhm.
But nonetheless, that's when we started to implement that, when we started to test against very small institutions. But how we mitigated that on the other scales where we have 10 gig testing nodes versus a 1 gig testing node, just so we don't overwhelm, we just started putting them in different dashboards and different test groups.
Okay.
So it's essentially, it's making sure that the fifth grader isn't in the same recess as the kindergartner, because otherwise, no matter what you do, somehow the kindergartner is going to get beat up.
Mm-hmm. Nope, understood. And unfortunately, the tools don't really have a stop button or a slow down button. So it's up to the engineer to sort of put either a limitation in place, or also having a lot of buffer in front of it can kind of mitigate that to a certain extent, but not a whole lot.
Yeah, and that's something we discussed during our second OARperf workshop. Is we encouraged everybody, hey, make sure you leave with everybody's card here, because if you just want to run some standard bandwidth tests, feel free to do it against my nodes. You're not going to bog this down. But if you need to test against a certain college for whatever reason, say they're near you geographically or something, email that person first and just say, hey, I'd really like to test against your node tomorrow. Is that okay? It's not always necessary, but it saves some headaches for some smaller institutions.
Okay. Do you have any sense of how much measurement traffic you've introduced onto the OARnet network as a result of this? Not that it would be taking over and you'd be at 90% or anything like that, but has this appreciably increased some of the network traffic reports as a result of the rollout?
No, we really haven't seen a giant, but it's worth noting that, we eat traffic, right? We have content servers that need to be filled with caching, and they've got way larger streams than I could ever accumulate with the OARperf project. So we haven't seen a giant uptick in traffic just because of my nodes being on the network. Now, some member institutions have reported that they see when it spikes every now and again, but they know that they're running a TCP bandwidth test every 4 hours. So if they look at their load balancer that's in front of their network, and for some reason it's running through that, they can typically see a very small intermittent spike, but after that they don't see anything. So I haven't had anybody complain yet that there was a issue.
So what about, okay, so it's not overwhelming anybody.
No.
Has anybody, as a result of the perfSONAR tests, realized that they needed upgrades or anything like that? Has this led to any either infrastructure changes or just changes in behavior after being rolled out?
I don't. So there was a reason why I put that the one line in there back in selling people on this. It hasn't made them realize, like, oh, maybe we do need a bigger pipe. OARnet provides a gateway for all of our clients to look at their statistics, and they can see how much of their bandwidth they're eating. But it's another graph that they can show a sea level with perfSONAR and say, hey, just so you know, maybe it's time to upgrade. And they go, oh, okay, this makes sense. This is easy. And, the network engineer can run this test at any given time and say, see, right now we're only getting this. And then they can go and talk to, whoever they need to work on getting the budget for that and getting that infrastructure upgrade.
And have you tried to partner this mesh activity with any other nearby regional networks, especially those that you maintain peering with?
Yeah, so we test against some of our good old friends up in Michigan. We are currently in the process of gaining access to the Quilt mesh. That way we're a part of that. We test against some of your ResNet hosts. We try to make ourselves as available and willing to test with other institutions as possible, because it just benefits everybody in the long run. That's the whole purpose of all of this, is it benefits everybody involved.
And I don't think I saw it in your presentation, but what are the specifications on the nodes that most of the universities are using at this point? Did you do a bulk buy altogether, or is it sort of ad hoc and whatever materials were available sort of thing?
Nope, we did a bulk buy. So they're running 1RU Dell servers. They have a 4-core processor. I think it's running at 3 gigahertz, if I remember correctly. It's either 2.8 or 3. They have 16 gigabytes of RAM, and they all have 1 terabyte hard drives. We're looking at possibly upgrading to an SSD because of some talks and presentations and some discussions we've had about SSD performance when you get above a gig. So we're talking about that. All of these have 1 gig copper on the back, but at the same time, they have the card where you can do a 10 gig SFP Plus connector. So we have some universities utilizing that as well. OARnet ourselves are actually utilizing that on one node. And the goal was, I know for a fact the 1 gigabit per second college isn't going to need this connector, but the fact that everybody has the same connector and everybody has the same server makes my life so much easier from an administrator standpoint. It made it easy when I was provisioning these. It made it easy to send them out, and it makes it easy to get them back if I know exactly what everyone has.
And has there been any thought of maybe for a future deployment, especially for the sites that are small, let's say K through 12 or anything of that nature, going to sort of the more smaller machines, those that are based on the ARM architecture or similar?
So we have some discussions about that. We have some questions, and there's been conversations, but with the most recent perfSONAR upgrade, we saw an uptick in performance requirements because of how pscheduler works and some other things. So we're working towards trying to figure out a solid way to run this on an ARM-style box. And some people have done it successfully with some qualms here and there. And that's very attractive to some of our institutions. The fact that they will be able to give this box, set it up so it runs DHCP on the interface, send it, give it to an intern and say, hey, I need you to go to dorm X, go to the 3rd floor, plug it in the network closet, and be able to run tests on it. That's a huge plus to some of these institutions, and they're really looking forward to being able to do that. But we're still in kind of the conversation phase. We're trying to see what other people do to make this work. There's been some success stories, some failure stories on each side. We've seen it in the cyber infrastructure engineer list, if not the perfSONAR user group list. You've seen those success stories or failure stories at the same time. But we're also kind of toying with the idea that we may have to kind of move away from a server architecture for some of these builds. In theory, if you look at some of the theory that you guys have posted or the perfSONAR group or what have you, there is research to support that a higher gigahertz clock can better support faster data transfers. So I make the argument on a regular basis that the gaming computer that's about 3 feet away from me right now running a 4.5 gigahertz clock may give me a much better result when I'm trying to do high performance testing, assuming I had a NIC that supports it. That box may do much better in testing, and it was a lot cheaper than the other servers we have. So, we're looking at these trade-offs and what works and what doesn't, and we're trying to look forward, seeing what we're going to do hardware-wise.
And there are some people that have sort of went that route, and they're using the quote-unquote gaming CPUs. I know that somebody who's building a 100 gig node went that route, and their reasoning is pretty sound. They don't need to have multiple cores or multiple processors because, honestly, it's a machine that's going to be testing serially. You can only do one perfSONAR test at a time if you're running pscheduler or BWCTL or what have you. So because of that, why go let all those extra cores go to waste? So it's certainly something that I think that is going to get a lot more play. And motherboards that run that thing can easily be stuck inside of an existing 1U server. It's not like that requires any additional extra support. It may get a little bit hotter. It may require a little bit more power, but for the most part, it's probably a good trade-off versus the Xeon stuff.
Yeah, especially when you look at price to performance ratio here. I mean, how much do you pay for a new Xeon processor, the E5 series, or how much do you pay for an Intel 7700K? Look at the cost benefits here, and look at the just the hardware benefits. Like you said, you might run into some qualms when you're trying to put these boards into servers, but it's nothing that can't be worked out. We can figure this out.
Mm-hmm. So when are you due for a hardware upgrade?
I would like to say probably within the next year. We need to start rolling out some newer nodes for when we start doing higher bandwidth testing. I want to have some new stuff to play with. But I think right now what we're really focused on is looking at the ARM, looking at the smaller computing power nodes, trying to make something work with them. Because like I said, that's a huge plus to a lot of the institutions that have a large campus.
Okay. Well, I'll remind everybody again, keep the questions coming. Doesn't look like we've had any additional come in through chat. I guess I'll go back to the problem solving phase just because I enjoy talking about those things. Beyond the major universities, which I'm sure are big network users, do you have any interesting stories just from a small institution? Were you able to fix anything for the person who's at the end of the 15 meg connection or anything of that nature?
Yeah, it was nice to be able to correlate 24-hour OWAMP data over with just what we see in the NOC. We have a pretty rigorous testing setup for the network. But it was nice just to be able to correlate some of the more finite OWAMP details over a 24-hour period. We found some issues. We said, hey, every day, they just knew their network was going down at one point in time. But we can say, hey, every day at 8 o'clock, your network really starts to creep up on usage. 8:30 is kind of close, but we don't see a drop there. I said, where we really see drops is right around the 5 o'clock hour, which makes 0 sense. And the system administrator said, oh, yeah, that's when I push patches. So the system administrator from the remote site was pushing giant patches to this little 15 meg site, and it was essentially denial of servicing his own site. So you start to find those little, not network errors or not machine errors, just we start to find some of the human errors or things that were overlooked because we didn't have this tool to provide insight into that. It allows for a conversation. It allows for a discussion.
So in that particular problem, was there any mitigating step that could have been taken, better schedule the patch delivery or offer a local cache of patches, or no?
It was both. It was, hey, maybe we need to do this a better way. I think instead of just pushing it out to the entire site, he started to push it out via groups and directory. But the biggest part is I think they did eventually end up putting, or at least they discussed it for a very long time, putting in an update server. That way this was mitigated on the intra-network side and on the LAN side. So there's kind of two mitigations at play there.
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting story.
Well, it's different compared to all the, we talk about switch memory buffer and we talk about some weird routing loop or something like that. And it's like, we can find most of that with our traditional monitoring software. It's just that perfSONAR allows us for this really in-depth look at weird problems. That's what we kind of use it for, as our one-off, really curious, well, what's going on here, guys, problems.
All right. Well, I've reached the end of the questions that I jotted down. We'll wait a minute here and see if anybody else has any others. Do want to thank you for giving this talk. I think that this is a very prescriptive sort of lesson for a lot of the regionals and larger universities. Do you have any documentation of sort of lessons learned from your rollout over the year that are posted anywhere or that could be posted?
I can get a blog post out over some of actually, I think the social guys have been bugging me about that. So I can get something posted on the pain points and things like that. And just, in essence, if I could go back to day one, what I would do differently as far as the rollout and things like that. I'd be more than happy to do that because I think it would provide an excellent blueprint / path for some other regionals that want to do this, or even just a university. If you have a big university and you want to make a 5 or 6 node perfSONAR deployment, it's probably worth your time.
Yeah, I think that'd be great if you had the ability to get that going, and we'd be happy to share it on this list and post it on Faster Data if you're willing.
Awesome, that'd be great.
All right, well, thanks again. And sounds like we have no additional questions, so I'll end it for today. So thanks everybody to joining, and thank you, Cody. Send me those slides and that link to your dashboard, and we'll get that posted. And just a reminder for everybody, we will be back next week, same time and place, and our talk is going to be from some good friends of mine, the Network Startup Resource Center. They're located at the University of Oregon, and they are a group that does a very altruistic and important task. They parachute into emerging countries and they set up research and education networks. So I told them to bring their really interesting stories. So I think they're going to have a really good talk next week. So thanks again, everybody. Have a good weekend, and we'll talk to you all soon.
All right. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it.